How did your neighbor's harassment complaint destroy their own restraining order case? The police knocked on my door at 8 in the morning on a Thursday with a complaint form that accused me of stalking my neighbor, Vanessa Caldridge, for the past 6 months. Officer Daniels asked if I knew why he was there, and I told him no, because I'd barely spoken to the woman since she moved in next door last year. He read from the report stating that I'd been watching her through my windows, following her to her car, leaving threatening notes on her windshield, and making late-night phone calls to intimidate her. Every accusation was false, but the officer's expression told me he was taking this seriously. He asked where I'd been the previous night around 11, when Vanessa claimed I'd banged on her door and shouted threats. I told him I'd been at my girlfriend Amy's apartment across town and could prove it. He wrote that down and said I'd likely hear from the court about a restraining order hearing. I closed the door feeling sick because I worked as a high school teacher, and any suggestion of stalking or threatening behavior could destroy my career, even if the accusations were proven false. I called Amy immediately and explained what happened. She was furious and said Vanessa must be insane to make up such serious lies. I asked her to write down everything about the previous night, including what time I'd arrived at her apartment and when I'd left this morning. She said she would and asked why Vanessa would target me specifically. I had no answer because my only interactions with Vanessa had been polite nods when we happened to be outside at the same time. She'd moved into the rental house next door 14 months ago and kept to herself mostly. She was in her late 30s, worked from home doing something with graphic design, and drove a silver sedan. That was all I knew about her. Amy said I needed to get a lawyer immediately because false accusations could escalate quickly. I spent the rest of the day calling attorneys and finally found one named Leonard Briggs, who specialized in restraining order defense. He agreed to meet me that afternoon at his office downtown. Leonard's office was small and cluttered with case files stacked on every surface. He listened while I explained the situation and took notes in a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he asked if I had any documentation of my whereabouts during the times Vanessa claimed I was harassing her. I showed him my phone's location history, proving I was at work or Amy's apartment during most evenings. He said that was good, but we'd need more than GPS data. He asked if I had security cameras on my property. I said no, but several neighbors did, including the retired couple across the street named Walter and Doris Fleming. Leonard told me to get copies of any footage from the past 6 months that showed my driveway and Vanessa's property. He also requested character references from colleagues and friends who could testify I wasn't the type of person to stalk or threaten anyone. The retainer fee was $3,000, which wiped out most of my savings, but I had no choice. Leonard filed an immediate response denying all allegations and requesting a full evidentiary hearing. The temporary restraining order arrived by mail 3 days later. It prohibited me from coming within 100 yards of Vanessa, contacting her by any means, or entering her property. The order would remain in effect until the hearing scheduled for 3 weeks away. I read through Vanessa's declaration attached to the order and felt my hands start shaking. She'd written 5 single-spaced pages detailing alleged harassment that included dozens of specific incidents with dates and times. According to her statement, I'd started watching her from my bedroom window within weeks of her moving in. She claimed I'd stand there for hours staring at her house. She said I'd followed her to the grocery store on multiple occasions and stood behind her in checkout lines making threatening comments. She alleged I'd left notes on her car calling her vulgar names and threatening violence. She said I'd called her phone from blocked numbers late at night and breathed heavily without speaking. The most disturbing allegation was that I'd broken into her backyard 2 months ago and left a dead bird on her patio as a warning. Every word was fabricated but written with such specific detail that someone who didn't know me might believe it. I met with Leonard again to go through Vanessa's declaration point by point. He asked me to document everything I could about my actual activities during the dates she'd listed. I pulled up my work calendar, credit card statements, and phone records. On the date she claimed I followed her to the grocery store, I'd been at a mandatory teacher training session 40 miles away with 30 witnesses. On the night she claimed I broke into her yard, I'd been at a colleague's retirement dinner with a dozen people who could verify my presence. The threatening phone calls she described had supposedly come from blocked numbers, but my phone records showed I'd never blocked my number or called her at all. Leonard said this was good, but we needed more. He asked if I'd be willing to take a polygraph test. I said yes immediately. He scheduled it for the following week with an examiner named Patricia Voss who worked with law enforcement. The polygraph took 2 hours in a sterile room that smelled like disinfectant and anxiety. Patricia attached sensors to my chest, fingers, and arm while explaining how the test worked. She asked baseline questions first about my name, age, and occupation. Then she moved to specific questions about Vanessa's allegations. Had I ever followed Vanessa anywhere? No. Had I ever left notes on her vehicle? No. Had I ever made threatening phone calls to her? No. Had I ever been in her backyard without permission? No. Had I ever watched her through my windows? No. Patricia's expression remained neutral throughout the entire process. When she finished, she removed the sensors and told Leonard she'd have the results within 24 hours. I left feeling drained and humiliated that I had to prove I wasn't a stalker to clear my name. Patricia's report came back the next day. I'd passed every question with no signs of deception. Leonard included this in our evidence file along with statements from Amy, my principal, 3 teacher colleagues, and the Flemings from across the street. Walter Fleming had provided particularly helpful information. He'd mentioned that he'd installed new security cameras 6 months ago that covered his driveway, but also captured portions of my property and Vanessa's front yard. He'd burned several weeks of footage onto external drives for Leonard to review. I spent an evening at Leonard's office watching grainy security footage on his laptop. The cameras showed my car leaving for work each morning around 6:30 and returning around 4 in the afternoon. They showed me leaving again several evenings per week around 7 and returning late, or not until the next morning when I stayed at Amy's place. Most importantly, they showed Vanessa's property during the time she claimed I was harassing her. On the date she said I'd left a threatening note on her windshield, the footage showed no one approaching her car except Vanessa herself. Leonard paused the video and replayed that section in slow motion. The timestamp showed 8:15 on a Saturday morning 3 months ago. Vanessa walked out of her house carrying something small in her hand. She went to her car parked in her driveway, looked around briefly, then appeared to place something under her windshield wiper. She went back inside. 10 minutes later, she came back out, approached her car, and removed whatever she'd placed there. She looked at it, then pulled out her phone. Leonard and I looked at each other with the same realization. She'd staged it. She'd put the note on her own windshield and then called the police to report finding a threatening message. Leonard said this was exactly what we needed, but we had to review all the footage to see if there were other instances. We spent 4 more hours going through the recordings. We found 3 additional incidents where Vanessa appeared to stage harassment. Once she walked to her backyard gate and looked around before going inside, then came out again and called the police. Another time she stood in her driveway holding her phone and speaking into it while gesturing at my house even though I wasn't home. The pattern was clear. Vanessa had been manufacturing evidence of harassment. Leonard said this completely changed our defense strategy. We weren't just denying her allegations anymore, we were proving she'd fabricated them deliberately. He asked if I had any idea why she might target me specifically. I thought about it and remembered one incident from about 8 months ago that hadn't seemed significant at the time. Vanessa had knocked on my door one evening asking if I wanted to come over for dinner. I'd politely declined, saying I had a girlfriend. She'd seemed disappointed, but said maybe another time. That was the only personal interaction we'd ever had beyond basic greetings. I told Leonard about this, and he wrote it down. He said rejected romantic interest was a common motivation for false stalking allegations. He asked if there'd been any other interactions. I mentioned that about a month after that dinner invitation, I'd started dating Amy more seriously, and Amy's car had been parked in my driveway overnight several times per week. Vanessa would have noticed that. Leonard scheduled depositions for both Vanessa and me as part of the pre-hearing discovery process. My deposition happened first in a conference room at Vanessa's attorney's office. Her lawyer was a young woman named Jessica Sterling, who seemed aggressive from the moment I sat down. She asked hundreds of questions about my relationship with Vanessa, my daily routine, my work schedule, and my past relationships. I answered honestly and calmly, even when she tried to make innocent activities sound suspicious. She asked why I left for work so early each morning. I explained I had to be at school by 7 for morning supervision duty. She asked why I stayed at Amy's apartment so frequently. I said because we were in a relationship. She asked if I'd ever felt rejected by Vanessa. I said no, because I'd never pursued her. Jessica kept pushing, but I maintained consistent answers throughout the 3-hour deposition. Leonard barely had to object because I was telling the truth and had nothing to hide. Vanessa's deposition happened a week later at Leonard's office. I sat in the corner taking notes while Leonard questioned her. Vanessa was thin with blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She wore a conservative dress and minimal makeup. She seemed nervous when Leonard asked her to describe the first incident of alleged harassment. She said it started about 7 months ago when she noticed me standing at my bedroom window looking at her house. Leonard asked what time of day this was. She said usually early evening. He asked how she could be sure I was looking at her house rather than just standing at my window. She said she could tell by my body language. Leonard asked if she'd ever confronted me about this behavior. She said no because she was afraid. He asked if she'd considered closing her curtains if she felt watched. She said she shouldn't have to change her behavior because of my harassment. Leonard nodded and moved on to the grocery store incident. He asked which store and what date. Vanessa provided both. He asked what I'd said to her specifically. She said I'd whispered that she should watch her back. Leonard asked if anyone else heard this. She said no, because I'd made sure to stand close and speak quietly. Leonard pulled out my attendance record from the teacher training session, proving I couldn't have been at the grocery store that day. Vanessa's face went pale, and she said she must have confused the date. Leonard asked her to look at her original declaration where she'd written the specific date. She insisted it must be a different incident she was thinking of. Leonard methodically went through every allegation in her declaration and asked for specific details. With each question, Vanessa's answers became less certain. She contradicted herself multiple times. She claimed the threatening phone calls came at 11 at night, but then said she'd been asleep and checked her call log in the morning. When Leonard asked how she knew I'd made the calls if they were from blocked numbers, she said she recognized my breathing pattern. The explanation sounded absurd, even to her own lawyer. Jessica called for breaks multiple times to confer with her client. Each time they returned, Vanessa seemed more flustered and defensive. The deposition lasted 5 hours, and by the end, Vanessa was crying and saying she just wanted protection from someone who was making her feel unsafe. Leonard's cross-examination had exposed significant holes in Vanessa's story, but we still needed to prove she'd actively fabricated evidence. He subpoenaed her phone records to verify whether she'd actually received the harassing calls she claimed. The records came back showing no incoming calls from blocked or unknown numbers during the time periods she'd specified. Leonard also subpoenaed surveillance footage from the grocery store where she claimed I'd threatened her. The footage showed Vanessa shopping alone that day, with no one matching my description anywhere in the store. We now had proof that multiple allegations were demonstrably false. Leonard filed a supplemental brief with the court outlining these discrepancies and attaching the security camera footage from the Flemings showing Vanessa staging the note incident. He also filed a motion requesting the court sanction Vanessa for filing frivolous claims and asked that she be ordered to pay my legal fees. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning in a courtroom that smelled like floor polish and tension. Judge Michael Abbott sat behind the bench reviewing case files when we entered. Vanessa sat with Jessica Sterling at the petitioner's table, wearing a dark blue suit and glasses I'd never seen her wear before. Leonard and I sat across the aisle. The bailiff called the case, and Judge Abbott asked Jessica to present Vanessa's evidence first. Jessica called Vanessa to testify and asked her to describe the harassment she'd experienced. Vanessa's voice shook as she repeated the allegations from her declaration. She said she'd been terrified living next door to someone who watched her constantly and made threats. She said she'd stopped going outside during certain hours to avoid encountering me. She said she'd installed extra locks on her doors and windows because she feared for her safety. Judge Abbott listened without expression and took notes. When Jessica finished her direct examination, Leonard stood up for cross-examination. Leonard started by asking Vanessa about the grocery store incident. She repeated her claim that I'd threatened her in the checkout line. Leonard introduced the store's surveillance footage on a laptop connected to the courtroom's display screen. The footage played, showing Vanessa shopping alone without anyone approaching or speaking to her. Leonard paused the video and asked Vanessa to point out where I'd supposedly threatened her. She stared at the screen and said the camera must not have captured that particular angle. Leonard pointed out that the store had 12 cameras covering every aisle and checkout area, and none of them showed me in the store at all that day. He then introduced my attendance record from the teacher training session. Vanessa's face flushed red, and she said she must have gotten confused about which day it happened. Leonard asked if she was certain it happened at all. Jessica objected, but Judge Abbott overruled her and told Vanessa to answer. Vanessa said she was certain, but perhaps it was a different grocery store. Leonard pointed out that her declaration specifically named the store and provided the exact date. Leonard moved on to the phone calls. He asked Vanessa how many times I'd allegedly called her from blocked numbers. She said at least 20 times over several months. Leonard introduced her phone records showing 0 incoming calls from blocked or unknown numbers during the entire time frame. Vanessa said maybe the calls hadn't been blocked, but she'd deleted them from her log. Leonard asked why she would delete evidence of harassment if she was planning to seek a restraining order. Vanessa didn't have an answer. Judge Abbott leaned forward and asked Vanessa directly whether she'd kept any physical evidence of the threatening notes she claimed to have found on her car. Vanessa said she'd thrown them away because they upset her too much to keep. The judge asked why she wouldn't preserve evidence. Vanessa said she hadn't been thinking clearly due to the stress. Leonard then introduced the Flemings' security footage showing Vanessa placing something under her own windshield wiper and later removing it. The courtroom was silent as the video played. Vanessa's face went from red to pale. She stammered that the footage must be edited or taken out of context. Judge Abbott stopped the proceedings and asked to see Leonard in chambers along with Jessica. They returned 15 minutes later and the judge's expression had changed to barely concealed anger. He asked Leonard to continue. Leonard called Walter Fleming to testify. Walter explained his security camera system and confirmed the footage was authentic and unedited. He testified that he'd reviewed months of recordings at Leonard's request and found multiple instances where Vanessa appeared to be staging incidents. He said he'd never witnessed me behaving inappropriately or approaching Vanessa's property. Leonard then called Amy to testify. She confirmed I'd been with her during several of the dates and times Vanessa claimed I was harassing her. She provided receipts, photos, and text messages corroborating our whereabouts. Leonard called my principal, who testified that I was a respected teacher with no history of concerning behavior and had perfect attendance on the dates in question. 3 of my teacher colleagues provided similar testimony. Each witness dismantled another piece of Vanessa's allegations. Judge Abbott called a recess after Amy's testimony. We stood in the hallway, and Leonard said things were going better than expected. Vanessa and Jessica were in a corner, having what appeared to be a heated conversation. When we returned to the courtroom, Jessica announced that Vanessa wanted to withdraw her restraining order petition. Leonard immediately objected and said we had a right to complete the hearing and present all our evidence. Judge Abbott agreed. He said the case had raised serious concerns about false reporting and abuse of the court system that needed to be addressed. Jessica looked uncomfortable but nodded. Leonard called me to testify. I explained my limited interactions with Vanessa and denied every allegation she'd made. I described the dinner invitation she'd extended and my polite refusal. I testified that I'd never contacted her except for that single conversation at my door. Jessica cross-examined me, but couldn't shake my testimony because I was telling the truth. Leonard then introduced my polygraph results, showing no deception. Judge Abbott reviewed the report carefully. After all testimony concluded, Judge Abbott took a brief recess to review the evidence. When he returned, his expression was severe. He started by denying Vanessa's restraining order petition in its entirety. He said the evidence showed not only that the allegations were unsupported, but that they appeared to be deliberately fabricated. He noted the security footage showing Vanessa staging incidents, the phone records contradicting her claims of harassing calls, the store surveillance proving she'd lied about the grocery store confrontation, and the multiple witnesses placing me elsewhere during alleged harassment. Judge Abbott said these weren't simple misunderstandings or mistaken perceptions, but rather a calculated pattern of false accusations. He said filing a restraining order petition required truthfulness and good faith, neither of which Vanessa had demonstrated. The judge then addressed Vanessa directly and asked if she understood the seriousness of what she'd done. Vanessa started crying and said she just wanted protection. Judge Abbott said protection from what, since the evidence proved I'd done nothing wrong. The judge asked Jessica if she wanted to present any explanation for her client's conduct. Jessica said Vanessa had been genuinely frightened and may have misinterpreted innocent activities. Judge Abbott said the security footage of Vanessa staging evidence made that explanation impossible to accept. He said Vanessa had wasted court resources, subjected me to unwarranted legal expenses and reputational harm, and potentially jeopardized my career with false stalking accusations. He granted Leonard's motion for sanctions and ordered Vanessa to pay my attorney's fees, totaling $7,000 plus court costs. He also stated he was forwarding the case file to the district attorney's office for review of possible criminal charges for filing a false police report and perjury. Vanessa stood up and started to speak, but Jessica pulled her back down. Judge Abbott said he was issuing a restraining order, but not the one Vanessa had requested. He was ordering Vanessa to stay 100 yards away from me, my property, my workplace, and my girlfriend. He said if she violated the order or made any further false accusations, he would hold her in contempt and she would face jail time. Vanessa left the courtroom crying with Jessica trying to console her. Leonard shook my hand and said the outcome was as good as we could have hoped for. I felt relief mixed with exhaustion. The entire process had taken 6 weeks and cost me my savings plus additional money I'd borrowed from my parents. My reputation at work had been damaged by rumors despite my principal's support. Amy had been dragged into a legal proceeding she never asked for. All because Vanessa had decided to fabricate a harassment campaign when I'd politely declined her dinner invitation. Leonard said the district attorney would likely file charges based on the evidence. He gave me copies of all the court records in case Vanessa violated the restraining order or made any future allegations. I drove home that afternoon feeling vindicated, but also aware of how easily false accusations could have destroyed my life if I hadn't had documentation and witnesses to prove my innocence. 2 weeks after the hearing, I received notice that Vanessa had been charged with 3 misdemeanor counts of filing false police reports. The charges carried potential jail time and fines. Leonard said she'd probably take a plea deal to avoid trial. I also received a check from Vanessa's lawyer for the $7,000 in attorney's fees the judge had ordered. The money covered most of my legal costs, but not the emotional toll or time lost. Amy and I had several long conversations about what happened. She was angry that Vanessa had targeted me and worried about whether she might try something again, despite the restraining order. I reassured her that Vanessa now had too much to lose by violating the judge's orders. My principal called to let me know the school district's legal counsel had reviewed the case and confirmed my exoneration. He said my job was secure and the false accusations wouldn't affect my employment record. That conversation lifted a weight I'd been carrying since the police first knocked on my door. Vanessa's house went up for sale 3 weeks after the hearing. I watched through my front window as the realtor hammered a sign into her lawn. She'd apparently decided to move rather than live next door to someone she'd tried to destroy with false accusations. Part of me felt satisfied seeing her forced to leave. Another part felt sad that a person could be so vindictive over a simple rejection. The house sold within a month to a young couple with 2 small children. They introduced themselves when they moved in and seemed friendly. I didn't mention what had happened with the previous owner. Leonard called in early autumn to tell me Vanessa had pleaded guilty to 2 counts of filing false reports and been sentenced to 6 months probation, 100 hours of community service, a $5,000 fine, and mandatory counseling. She'd also been ordered to pay restitution for the city's costs in investigating her false claims. He said this was a relatively light sentence, but created a criminal record that would follow her. I asked if she could still appeal the restraining order against her. Leonard said no. That order was final and enforceable for 3 years. I saw Vanessa one final time, 6 months after the hearing. I was at a restaurant downtown with Amy when I noticed her sitting alone at the bar. She looked thinner and tired. Our eyes met across the room, and she quickly looked away. Amy noticed and asked if we should leave. I said no because we had every right to be there, and Vanessa couldn't dictate where I went. We finished our meal and left without further interaction. Amy asked if I felt closure about everything that happened. I thought about it and realized I did. Vanessa had tried to weaponize the legal system against me and instead destroyed her own credibility and freedom. She'd lost her home, her money, her reputation, and gained a criminal record. The restraining order she'd sought had been turned against her. The harassment complaint she'd filed had been exposed as a fabrication. Every lie she told had been documented and disproven. Justice had been served not through my actions, but through her own self-destructive pattern of deception. 18 months after the original complaint, I married Amy in a small ceremony with close friends and family. We bought a house together in a different neighborhood across town. The Flemings sent a card congratulating us and thanking us for being good neighbors during a difficult time. Leonard attended the wedding and joked that he hoped never to represent me again. My principal gave a toast about character being revealed through adversity. I thought about how close I'd come to losing everything because of one person's lies, but I also thought about how the truth had prevailed because I'd kept records, maintained relationships with honest people, and refused to let false accusations define me. The experience taught me that documentation matters, that credibility is earned through consistency, and that people who weaponize accusations against others often end up destroying themselves in the process. Vanessa's harassment complaint hadn't just failed. It had backfired completely and demonstrated to everyone involved that she was the one who posed a threat, not me. The restraining order she sought became her own punishment. That irony felt like justice. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.